Part-Time Hitter is brought to you by Friendly Forces, a 501c3 nonprofit committed to helping reserve component members seamlessly integrate their military service with rewarding civilian careers. We connect them with employers who value their unique skills and critical role in national security and advise organizations how to become more reservist-friendly. Check them out at www.friendlyforces.org. Friendly Forces is also brought to you by the Fratty Guard, a lifestyle brand for part-time hitters. Check them out at www.thefrattyguard.com and on Instagram at @thefrattyguard. This episode of Part-Time Hitter is sponsored by ClearanceJobs. Check them out at www.clearancejobs.com. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Part-Time Hitter podcast. I'm your host, Eric Evans, and today I am joined by Lindy Kyzer from ClearanceJobs. Lindy is the director of content for ClearanceJobs. I'm going to give an overview of ClearanceJobs, Lindy, and if I'm wrong, feel free to correct me. But
no, I won't do that.
ClearanceJobs is a specialized job board and career resource platform for connecting employers with candidates who hold clearances of different levels. And generally, it's tailored towards industries that need to leverage those clearances. So Intel, the military sort of industry, cybersecurity, things of that nature. Career resource, I've used it many times in the past. Did I miss anything? Did I get that right?
You got it right. Yes, we are the home, the community of the clearance community, basically at ClearanceJobs. Try to be a one-stop shop for resources, tools, career advice. Hopefully folks follow us on social media as well as are an active member of the community when it comes to searching for employers and jobs and positions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining me today. I've been looking forward to this episode because I work in the cleared sector. Many of my friends do, and we get a lot of questions, or I get a lot of questions about clearances, how they work, how to get a clearance, all sorts of things. We'll get into that later. But thank you for joining us today. As I said, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and I am not an expert on it. So I'm happy to reconnect with you because we did speak on your podcast, which I think is the ClearanceJobs podcast, right? Probably about a year ago now, I would think. We're talking about Friendly Forces. So as you said before we started recording, how the turntables have turned. But here we are.
I love being a guest. Being a guest is my favorite. I do no prep, Eric. I just get to roll in. You have to ask all the hard-hitting questions. It's fantastic. I can't wait. Yes. No, we loved highlighting Friendly Forces. I think it's really cool what you guys do in terms of, letting folks know about the job market out there for reservists. And I think that's a great topic to touch on today when it comes to clearance process, because that does come up. I know people hooting out, okay, fact or fiction, myth busting is one of my favorite things. Do people join the reserves just to hold their clearances?
Is that a question?
I've heard that people do that.
Is that a question?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm asking you. I flipped the coin already, Eric.
I think they do, although I'm gonna reverse Uno card you on that later on, basically to say, because this is one of the questions we got, like who really holds or owns the clearance, right? So not to get right into it, but since you brought it up, I'm a reservist and I have a clearance through the Army. I am a contractor. So who is it? The government? Is it my company? Is it the Army who is like magically holding this clearance somewhere? Or you know what I mean? Like who really owns it? I don't know that because I get asked that a lot and I'm not really sure.
All the terms are made up. Do you want me to answer it now? Or sorry, I dived for it. I got so excited I jumped the gun.
No worries. We'll get into that later.
Wait.
That was okay. That was one of the questions I had. But to your point, the cleared sector is such a natural career space for reservists or people coming off of active duty that held clearances, because we're in the civilian sector. We have this military experience, we have clearances, and we need full-time civilian jobs. So it's kind of a natural area for reservists to work in, and many of them do work in the area, myself included. But that said, and going back to Friendly Forces, not even in that aspect, not all companies are created equal. So Friendly Forces looks at some of the companies that are more friendly for reservists in the cleared space, but also not in the cleared space in general. But that's why this is such a salient topic, particularly for my audience of reservists and then people coming off of active duty who are looking into the Guard, looking in the Reserve, looking into defense contracting, all that good stuff. So we're gonna go open kimono on some of these important questions that hopefully I have answers for, or you have answers for. It can be a scary space. So I've heard for, I think, years that whoever it is, I guess is it OPM or whoever kind of owns the security clearance process, is supposed to be updating it, streamlining it, kind of reforming the entire clearance process. And I imagine COVID didn't help with any of that, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Clearance reform, I would love to talk about it, Eric, because you're trapped in like another decade when you said OPM managing the clearance process. But OPM still does have a role in the clearance process. So I get the confusion, and only wonky nerds like me care about all of the terms. And I do sort of respect that, right? We have the two sides of it. There's a lot of stuff that happens behind the kimono, as it were, to introduce the language of things like going on with your eligibility and your access that you probably don't need to care about or know about. But I think hopefully some of what we do at ClearanceJob is helping to show you those major lever areas where you probably should know what's going on. So when it comes to security clearance reform, we are in the midst of this massive overhaul of the clearance process called Trusted Workforce 2.0 right now. So we're doing a lot. I'm a big history buff, so we're going real retrograde at ClearanceJobs right now, doing a lot of 20 years history of clearance reform type of stuff. A white paper that's going to come out on the site soon is going to talk through that. We have a lot of content around the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Authorization Act that was signed 20 years ago that talked about clearance reform. And some of those topics are ones we are still talking about today. But the good news is that Trusted Workforce is the biggest overhaul since that IRPTA transformation that happened post 9/11. So there was an understanding we've kind of like had ideas for things that we should be doing. And now it's like, holy moly, let's kick somebody in the teeth and let's like actually get some of those reforms made. So some of that is trying to put more of the clearance investigative process into one entity. So again, if you're a reservist, good to know DCSA, the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, is running that process. So they're doing background investigations for the entire DoD and also 130-ish plus agencies within the national security and broader government community as well. Because as you know, like security clearance eligibility isn't just for folks in traditional national security careers as well, right? So that's a good takeaway too. If you're a reservist and you want to put your clearance to work, you might work for the Department of Treasury or the Department of Commerce or one of the thousands of contractors supporting those agencies. So you don't just have to go DoD when it comes to clearances,
Right.
But DoD is the biggest investigation provider. DCSA is probably doing a lot of that reform effort. A lot of those reforms, the 40-ish policies they've updated in the past, however many years, nobody cares about. The one key takeaway that I think it is worth talking about is continuous vetting, because continuous vetting does apply to all clearance holders now. So if you did not know, you sign something that says the government can continuously vet you when you hold a clearance. It's not looking into your social media history, but they are doing credit checks. They are getting flags for criminal conduct. And I think that's worth noting too, because we're seeing a slight uptick in the number of criminal conduct, clearance denials and revocations. And I would argue those are things that people had criminal issues that before continuous vetting, the government wouldn't have found out about. You could hide those DUIs under the closet, but now the government is going to know. So it's important to be proactive. The best way to mitigate any issue that comes up in the clearance process is to report it, to self-report it and be proactive. So I guess if I have one takeaway for the audience, if you have a clearance reform probably doesn't matter to you. It's not affecting your life day to day, but continuous vetting surely is. If you hold a clearance, you want to keep a clearance, you need to know that issues that would be adjudicatively relevant are going to come up under continuous vetting. So keep your house in order, be proactive, and don't be afraid to get help. So again, I say it, whether it's like, so I mentioned the DUIs just because that's a common question I get.
Right.
Don't be afraid to get alcohol treatment counseling, substance abuse counseling. Sometimes people, again, especially the military community, we had the mental health stigma. I think they've tried to be more proactive about that. Those things will not affect your clearance eligibility. I think we need to have the same thing when it comes to substances, right? Because we're just seeing a lot more people with marijuana in their background, with substance abuse issues, pharmaceutical misuse, which in the military community, over prescription of drugs. And then so being proactive, I think people are like, oh, realize they have a problem and then don't want to affect their job by doing it. But if you have a clearance, there is this two-sided thing. Being proactive is actually the best way to mitigate an issue because it shows that you're willing to go out and get help and address it. If it comes up in the clearance process, it's usually something that you didn't address.
Right. Is it truly continuous, or is it like they're reassessing you every year or every 2 years? Or if I get a DUI tomorrow, that's going to pop and they'll see it very quickly.
They'll see it very quickly. Like not, maybe not tomorrow. You'll have a few weeks to, figure out your life, but it will come up and your security officer will know. Now, again, the process is somewhat seamless. So again, a single DUI may or may not be adjudicatively relevant, right? So if you're a candidate that or an individual holding eligibility, the government knows about those things within DCSA. There's an entity that's kind of checking those things that come up. So that's another thing I like to say too. Just because maybe you can say like, I've had tons of crazy stuff happen, or my credit score, went down here and I went bankrupt and I never told anybody and nothing happened. Well, they're still checking alerts, and they're only checking them if they are adjudicatively relevant and a topic comes up. They're also checking to make sure if something gets flagged that it's actually you're the correct person. So there's data cleanup that goes into what's going on in that process. But yes, it's not like it's, because before it was once every 5 years. That stuff was not coming up. They were only doing the flags. Now they have an IT system that is literally maintaining clearance holders' records and checking them in a continuous fashion.
Are you still expected to refill out the SF, was it 86 or SF 50, something like that, every couple of years? Or is that no longer relevant because they're able to essentially pull that information themselves?
Oh, it's still there. It's now every 5 years. And then you're just getting me all fired up on all the hot topics, all the changes, Eric, because the SF 85 or SF 86 forms that we have now are going to be updated to a personnel vetting questionnaire within the next year, I think. So the SF 86 will go away. So again, does anybody care? I don't know, just me. But that form will go away. You will be updating your personnel vetting questionnaire every 5 years. That form is split into 4 parts, A, B, C, D. So the idea is, rather than filling out this monolith form every 5 years, you're only going to have to update the parts that you need to every 5 years.
No, that is good.
Now
the form is a bear for anyone who's ever had to fill it out, and you need a reference for anyone who can prove that you lived in this apartment for 3 weeks. And I think it goes back 7 or 10 years. And yeah, it's hard to fill out, even just to remember like where I was living or where I was working at the time. It's difficult. And then find somebody who can validate it is like, oh, and you can't repeat people. So you can't use your mom.
Yeah.
Once. So yeah, that form is a bear. So anything that can help kind of offload some of that is good.
The PVQ is way better, and it's coming in the next year. So that is a light at the end of the tunnel. And also the form has changed too. So it is all digital online. I'm old enough to remember the paper SF86, which was very sad for me. But you used to have it was filled out digitally, but I also had a printed out copy of my SF86. Now everything is within NBIS. There is e-app now. Cutting edge. You can save the form. It auto populates zip codes or addresses or like education institution addresses. Some of those dumb things you're like, oh my gosh, I have to look up the address for this place.
Right.
E-app does some of that for you, which has also been a big step ahead now that the digital form moved on from eQuip. No more eQuip. Everyone is under e-app now. So the form has changed, the technology has changed. And again, in the soon to come, the entire process of that filling out the PBQ over the SF86 will also apply.
What are you seeing in terms of, so if I was, I guess, applying, let's say I was applying for a clearance tomorrow and I submitted all the documentation, I guess, to start the investigation, what's the timeline generally that we're looking at from start to finish these days?
Oh, I should have looked it up before I came on here, but this is good because this is when I get to answer fake questions, which is my favorite. Make up the answers as I go, Eric. So it depends. It depends is always the answer. So they publish the averages. So if you go to ClearanceJobs.com, you can find the actual answer for what is the average DoD industry time. I want to say it's 90-ish days for a secret clearance and 180-ish days for a top secret clearance. I made that up because I can't remember exactly what it is, but that's a ballpark number. So what you're looking at too is close to half of a year for a TS and 3-ish months for a secret. But I always say is those are the averages. Most of the people that I end up talking to at ClearanceJobs are very special. So they've had foreign travel, they've had time overseas, they've had, there's something that makes their case a little more complex. And I always say, yeah, unfortunately, 6 months for a TS is average. If you have anything that makes you not average, you can expect that time to be bumped out further than that. So take it with a grain of salt. And IC is another story entirely. So if you're applying for CIA, NSA, DIA, even if it has 3 letters in it,
so
maybe odds to be ever in your favor. It's longer.
On top of kind of the more general process, they're doing some of their own vetting or
yes,
what?
They're special.
So it's like CIA or NSA. Is there an additional level of scrutiny of vetting that they're doing on top of it?
They have suitability requirements, and that's worth knowing. Every agency has its own suitability requirements. So sometimes look at those questions about, hey, what was this crazy form I had to fill out? Or what was this crazy additional like that my background investigator asked me some question that was, totally different. Usually they're applying for, again, a 3-letter agency, but even like DHS, even DEA, State Department, every agency has their own suitability requirements. So they are kind of able to look at individuals differently in the process. The path to clearance eligibility is universal, and there's all these rules and policies around reciprocity to ensure that if you have a security clearance, it should be able to transfer between agencies. But what you're seeing is more scrutiny within individual agencies is because they have these additional suitability. So suitability for the position requirements that are beyond just clearance eligibility.
That's a big issue I've seen, is just someone will have a top secret SCI poly from one agency and they're trying to get a job in a different agency, and it's like this massive issue or backlog just to get that clearance vetted and moved over. I mean, even I was in a building where someone was just moving from one division in the same building to a different division, and they were having trouble getting their clearance ported over. And I was like, this is crazy. Is there anything about that within any of the clearance reform initiatives?
100%. It's a topic we're totally going to be focused on at ClearanceJobs. And I'm also part of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance's Security Policy Reform Council. And we're talking a ton about that. And I would love to hear back from your community on this too, because I have heard a lot of chatter from NSA folks, specifically service members transitioning from NSA, saying, hey, I've been working at NSA, literally the exact same job, and I'm now trying to do that job as a contractor, and they're telling me I don't have the right polygraph eligibility. And they're like, I literally am sitting in the same office. Now that comes down to how the contracts are written too. So a contractor is required to have somebody doing that job that has a full scope polygraph, for instance. And again, as you know, in the military is like, nah, you're good. Like right. You can do it with a CI poly, or they have, they put butts in seats when they need butts in seats, and they don't have the same rules that the contractors do, where the contractor's like, no, I'm not, Uncle Sam's like, I'm not going to pay you if this person doesn't have this certain clearance eligibility, even though they can do the exact same job. So that's a frustration point. So anybody who has that experience, please reach out to us at ClearanceJobs. Find me online, send me a message, because you have to kind of show people those cases, right? Show them the human side of it. There's a policy there, but we don't always see the reality of like, no, this is Jill wants to go work in a job. She was literally doing this job as a service member. She should be able to do it as a contractor. We need to unsuck the process so that she can do that and get to work and not sit for 6 months to wait for some dot to be dotted.
I'm sure if I put that out on LinkedIn, I'll get plenty of angry and unhinged comments about personal experiences dealing with this type of thing. So yeah, I think we could probably help find some use cases.
Okay.
For sure. So are there any sort of trends or things that you see with service members not being aware of certain clearance things if they're, getting out of the military? I mean, you kind of mentioned one, but anything that they should be aware of or cognizant of as they're looking to enter into the cleared space after leaving the military?
Hands down, the biggest question I get, the one I'm sure every recruiter gets, is, hey, is my clearance still active or current? Like, do I still have a clearance if they've separated? So this is a policy that is changing, and I hesitate to say it because I keep getting people asking me for the policy. I've seen a draft policy that has this in it. I haven't, unfortunately, again, sometimes things are draft and then you're like, oh crap, this actually hasn't been published yet. I'm not allowed to publish FOUO documents. I don't want to go to jail.
Right.
But you've seen draft things, nothing public yet, saying that the window is going from 2 years to 3 years. And again, that is a part of the reforms under trusted workforce. And I think that's good. We want that flexibility. It's kind of an arbitrary determination right now for the 2 years. The government put some data behind it to say, hey, when is actually the amount of time when things do start to become an issue? Like, how long after you separate are you truly separated, right? Are you truly is there enough that's gone on that's going to make it that we need to re-clear you? And what they've said is like 3 years. If you've been within 3 years, so they're going to move that needle, which I think will be good. So folks coming out of the military, if you want to pursue something in the private sector, gives you a little bit more playtime. You're like, oh wait, actually I do miss that DoD culture, or I do really want to, I said I was never going to work in national security, and then I want to go back. It just gives you a little bit more time, which I think is great for transitioning service members. They are by far the demographic that asks me that question the most. So again, what I can say now is right now it's 2 years, moving to 3 years. So because of that, I know there's some agencies or entities that are starting to kind of use a 3-year window. Probably more of them are using a 2-year window, but that's also worth knowing too. What is the date when your clearance eligibility ends? It's theoretically the date that you separate from service, but there's some squishiness there because it's theoretically whenever your security officer removes you from the system, and that could be a little before or a little after that date, or whoops, maybe they forgot to do it. You just never know. So I think it's always good to you can ask a recruiter or ask a security officer to look at that date for you. You can submit a Privacy Act request to get a copy of your own information if you're after the fact. And the big thing that I get to is if you served in the Gulf War and you're wondering if your clearance is still current, no, 100% no, I can say that. If that security officer kept that eligibility, but I do get sometimes that question, I want to go back. And I was like, you will have to reapply.
So right now it's somewhere between, 2 and 3 years. So if I were to quit my contracting job and go work at Baskin Robbins for the next, 2 years, at some point randomly in some system will trigger that my clearance is no longer good and it'll fall off the edge of the earth, and I'm totally unclear.
I mean, the good news is they can still pull that investigation. So I just had this too, pulling in a 10-year-old security clearance. You can actually pull that record out. Now, it's not going to help you. You have to start over. So you don't have a clearance. So the information is still out there. I think that's good and worth people knowing. Again, especially now because we are moving into e-app. Folks are in NBIS or in these systems. So if your information is in that system, it can be pulled in and it can be accessed, and you're not necessarily starting from scratch if you're a recent veteran. So if you're somebody who served in the past 10 years, had eligibility in the past 10 years, the system should be able to pull in some of your data or at least see your prior eligibilities, right? So it's not we don't want to have to wonder, hey, did Eric ever really have a clearance? That's just good information for the government to have and maintain. So they can see your previous clearance, but what you're looking at is they're not going to trust that you haven't done anything bad in the time since if it's past that 2 to 3 year window. You have a 2-3 year window of being good in the government's eyes, and then past that we're it's a lot could have happened in that time span. We're going to start over. It's going to be a new investigation.
Yeah, because I've noticed in a lot of job applications they'll ask, do you have a clearance? Yes, no. And then have you ever held a clearance? I'm always wondering well, okay, why does it matter if I used to hold one? But apparently I guess that's beneficial. It's better than nothing. Says at some point
it is, and I'm glad that they ask that because I think that is a huge value to veterans. I think sometimes they forget, hey, if you had that prior clearance, there is value there. So even if it's your eligibility expired, or again you get transferred in the military, you were in a position that needed a clearance eligibility, and then you move into a position that doesn't require a clearance, the fact that you previously held a clearance, employers, because interim clearances, I said clearance processing times, an interim clearance can be issued in a week or two.
Right.
So average interim clearances within DoD are a week or two. So if you've had a prior clearance, somebody hiring is oh yeah, I'm going to be able to get this person
that makes sense,
an interim clearance really fast, versus if you've never had one, they're taking a chance and saying, hey, like we said before, if you have issues in your background, a lot of foreign travel, terrible credit history, or any kind of messiness, you might not get that interim clearance. Your chances of a final clearance are still good, but employers might say, I don't have the time to spend.
So regarding interim clearances, does pretty much everyone get one? Is there any sort of surface level investigation done to grant an interim clearance, or is it we'll give it to you, but
it's doing that basic criminal credit. If you have no criminal or credit flags, you are probably likely to get an interim clearance, or you don't have anything on your SF-86 that's serious red flags. You're indicating anything on there that's oh, this is extensive foreign travel or first generation immigrant coming in from a potentially hostile country. There are certain things that are going to get flagged, but by and large, if you have decent criminal credit history, but that's another thing again, DoD versus the IC, which is special. The intelligence community doesn't do interim clearances, period. So that's why I say, if you want to work within the IC, if that's your career path, you need to prepare for a much longer onboarding process to get into the IC.
So to that point, what are kind of the major reasons you see for people being denied clearances these days?
This is perfect because we just published this article in ClearanceJobs, the top cause of clearance denial and revocation for 2024. Financial issues, by and large, are the number one topic. And again, this is unaddressed financial issues. So if you have, and there else caveat, if you want to work for the government, you've got to pay your taxes. Like, it cracks me up when I see the people who like don't have tax issues, and they're like, Uncle Sam, got to pay Uncle Sam. Like, you can't work for Big Daddy if you have not paid him recently. So there's just
the guy who you're trying to get a job from.
Yeah. So it always cracks me up though when people are like have a failure to pay taxes or significant issues. And this is where most of those denials and revocations that I see though, if somebody again had been proactive, gotten financial counseling, addressed the issue before applying. And this is why sometimes if you can spend 6 months preparing to get a clearance, your likelihood of getting a clearance is much higher than if you're like, hey, I'm just going to apply and see what happens. That's not a good idea. So if you know you have significant debt, if there's a debt you haven't paid in a while, start paying it. Like, just create a plan. And I think sometimes because debt, unfortunately, it's like, it doesn't go away. Like, the government will see it. And it's kind of thing like expunged records. You know, people are always like, well, I committed this crime, but it was expunged from my record. Not for a security clearance. You know, it's different than like criminal. They're actually looking at behavior and not consequences. So it's a very different process. So the thing too, charges, like, I think you look at in the real world, it's like, well, I got charged with something, but they dropped the charges or something. So it's not adjudicatively relevant. For the government, we're like, well, no, we care about the behavior. So if you were charged with money laundering and then you were able to plead down the charges, we're still like, maybe we still don't trust you to work at a job in finance for the government. So I think there's those two things. So financial issues, number one, drug issues are number two. This is huge now.
Yeah.
Typically it's people lying about their drug use on the application, or more and more, a lot of people are applying for a clearance in a state where marijuana is legal and saying, I'm going to keep using marijuana, because they're like, federal government, you're dumb. So this is where this is another, I guess we'll put it under a reform category, even though it's not clearance reform. If marijuana gets rescheduled to a Schedule 3 drug, then folks using it with a prescription will be able to keep their clearance eligibility. The issue now is decriminalization and all of that is not relevant in the clearance process. It is still illegal at the federal level. And that's the government is looking at. And I see all of these people shooting their shot. I mean, like, let's try. Maybe I'll be the one. And 100% of the time so far, the government is like, you are not the one. If you say you're going to keep using drugs on your security clearance application, you will not get a clearance.
I was going to say, so what if you say you, up until maybe fairly recently, maybe there's some time frame, I used to use them, I've stopped using drugs and I'm never going to use them again. Will the government look favorably on that, or is that still like a come back in 5 years and maybe we'll talk type thing?
Yes, the government will look favorably on that. At this point, if you've previously done drugs, and OD&I even had a policy that was released on that. If you had used drugs prior to filling out your SF-86, they had a policy saying that should not be relevant to denial or revocation of clearance. Don't do drugs, kids. You'll end up with kids. No, that's not true. That's not how this happened.
Yeah, I mean, the drug issue is an interesting one just because it's like, yeah, the federal government hasn't caught up to what a lot of the states are doing. And I was actually just explaining this to somebody like yesterday. I can't remember who, but as a clearance holder, you're actually not allowed to hold stock in like weed or marijuana companies because in theory that's distributing drug, which is pretty crazy to me.
Yeah. No, because it's drug involvement is actually what the adjudicative guideline says. So if you were involved in drug use, profiting from it in some way, I always get like the drug sales. I sold my Adderall in college. Well, what's wrong with that? Like, you were the drug dealer. Like, that's how the government looks at it. They don't have the same like ways that, we maybe explain away kind of what we do as being part of our culture or our age or whatever. They're like, no, it's illegal. Selling a controlled substance is a bad idea. This is an issue.
Okay. So financial issues, drugs, are those probably make up like what? 90% of the DQs, or is there any other sort of big ones?
Yeah, those are the big ones. Criminal conduct is the other one. And I think I mentioned that before. We're seeing an increase in criminal conduct denials and revocations. And I think that's just due to more of those issues being flagged. Where previously you could have mitigated something that came up. Now the government's going to find out, because criminal conduct issues, you're not expected to be perfect. Having committed a crime is not going to result in denial or revocation, but they look at passage of time. And unfortunately now that's a topic with, that's an issue with continuous vetting. If you do something bad, The government looks at it right away. You don't have time to mitigate that issue. We're actually seeing foreign influence and foreign involvement denials and revocations decline, which I find interesting. I don't know if that's just because we're having fewer maybe foreign nationals apply into national security careers or whatever because of the lengthy timeline it takes to get a clearance. But yeah, it's criminal conduct, it's drug issues, it's financial issues for the vast, vast majority of the denials and revocations.
Can you hold a clearance if you're a dual citizen or a dual citizen of certain countries, or can you not be a dual citizen?
Yes, you can theoretically be a dual citizen of any country and still hold a clearance. So there used to be this kind of dual citizenship bad. You had to turn in your foreign passport or make a big deal about turning into your security officer, or they would rip it up in front of you and be very dramatic about it. Now they're like, that's a little over the top, because a lot of folks, if you're depending on your ancestry, you might have dual citizenship through nothing that you did. Right? Or in certain countries, you can't even renounce your dual citizenship. And then renouncing your citizenship in certain countries is actually more of a red flag than not. And we need foreign language experience in the IC and national security. We need some of those things that people who are immigrants, who have, who are now citizens of the US have. So the only caveat is you have to be a US citizen to have a clearance. But country of origin, there aren't any there's not oh, you can't be. It's going to be a little harder if you're from China or North Korea, but not necessarily a no-go, right? We have folks who have, countries of origin that are not quite friendly with the US, and you can still obtain a clearance. Getting clearance eligibility is 100% about what is in the best interest of the government. I always say that. People are always well, how could so-and-so get a clearance? I was like, if the government wants so-and-so to have a clearance, they will have clearance eligibility. And there are also limited access authorizations and a lot of things the government can do to get folks eligibility if they need them working in national security.
Well, yeah. So let's say the government they need me specifically because I'm the world's foremost expert on this thing. But I smoke weed every single day and I was born in North Korea, but I'm willing to work for the government. Can somebody just waive all of this, be like, okay, give him the clearance, we need him, or must it go through the rigid clearance process?
There are waivers and exceptions. Now, I will say, the currently doing drugs. Now, there's legislation called the Bond Amendment that's actually come out. So the Congress has mandated certain topics where, hey, if you're doing these things, you can't have SCI, you can't have top secret eligibility. And specifically, it was drug use, specific criminal conduct. Now, what we found, though, is that in almost every case, there have been waivers and exceptions granted for those, except for ongoing drug use. That seems to be the one that still no one who's saying, I'm constantly doing drugs or marijuana, and I'm going to keep doing drugs. But again, that's also should I do it? Everyone's talking about Elon Musk's security clearance, right? Or people talk about that. And I'm always like, nobody knows if Elon Musk has a clearance or what clearance he has, because all of it's covered by the Privacy Act, right? So if I want to say, hey, well, Eric has a TSSCI with whatever, I have no clue. And I never know if you're lying about it. The only people, if it's covered by the Privacy Act. So yes, a security officer, recruiter, or the person can look up your eligibility in the system of record. But when it comes to what eligibilities people have, you're speculating to talk about if you want to talk about a public figure's eligibility or access, because it's all covered by the Privacy Act and private. And again, because all of the clearance policy is born out of the executive branch, the White House, to keep getting it, making it spicy. The president has purview over the clearance process. So whoever the president is could literally say, hey, through my Article 15 powers as president, I would like Elon Musk to have access to whatever. And he is the keeper of the secrets. And now people get really squirrely about that, but I'm always I'm all about protecting the data at the data level. So the thing I made about Elon Musk is I don't think Elon Musk has maybe he does. How good is he at computers? I don't think he has a computer with access to the entire nation's secrets sitting with him. We have information siloed for a reason. And the biggest issue that we come into with leaks of classified information is usually because some schmuck got access to information and data that he should not have had.
Right.
So I'm a big proponent of the clearance process isn't broken. We don't need to bemoan the number of people with clearances or how that works. We need to protect the information at the level of the information, because if you protect the data, that's how you do it. I never get nervous if they're oh, how did so-and-so get a clearance? I'm well, probably better to have them inside the tent than outside.
Right.
It's kind of how it usually works.
So if you are if your clearance is denied, what do you do to fight that? And B, how often are those successful in getting those denials overturned? And I did just see a ClearanceJob's blog post or something on this, which is why I'm asking. But
hot topic. Yeah, so they did just change the due process for this, specifically for service members and civilians. Right now, again, you have an adjudicator who makes a decision on clearance eligibility. You get an initial kind of due process from that adjudicator who's going to give you a statement of reasons or a letter of intent to deny. So you have an opportunity to provide feedback on that prior to denial or revocation directly within DCSA to that adjudicator who made the decision. So usually maybe it's just follow up saying, hey, I'm going to provide, they have issues about your finances. Oh, I actually started a payment plan for this issue. Or, hey, we denied your clearance because you had this, you had these 2 DUIs. Oh, I actually went to an alcohol treatment program. I'm not, currently using substances. Whatever it is, you have a chance to mitigate that to the adjudicator. Then if they still decide to deny your clearance, you also have the opportunity to go through an appeal board. So there's an actual appeal process. You can appeal the denial based on a written record to provide a written response to the Doha judge to consider if your clearance should actually be denied or revoked. If it is denied at that point, then you're out of luck. You can reapply in a year. But the number of people who are actually denied at that point are like 1 to 2%.
Oh, wow.
It's really low.
Okay.
Because now there's numbers lie. So a lot of people just drop out of the process, right? You get your letter of intent to deny, you're like, I'm screwed, and they don't fight it. So that's the actual people who get all the way to a denial and then are denied. So I would say your chances of being able to obtain a clearance overall are favorable if you're persistent through the process. It is about weeding out people who are just like, I didn't want the job anyway.
Right.
I'm gonna,
Right.
Okay. Baskin Robbins sounds better. Unlimited ice cream. Take them away.
No, that's good to know. And so I have a number of other questions from the community, but I'm going to ask one that just occurred to me. And this is kind of a hot topic question too. I see this come up on LinkedIn from time to time, but listing your clearance on your LinkedIn profile or listing it publicly somewhere. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm team ClearanceJob. So I say go to the safe, happy place to list your clearance details. I just get way too much spam and scams on LinkedIn. It's not where I'm going to list my clearance level. People can figure it out if they're smart. And this is where recruiters are going to be mad at me because they're like, well, I want to see it right away. And then I'm like, well, go to ClearanceJobs and then list it there. But LinkedIn is publicly crawled, right? And we just see that all the time. Your LinkedIn data, there's tons of third-party sites. And all of the data they pull in is what's on LinkedIn. So it's like, if you would like to send all of your personal data directly to China, that's what you post on LinkedIn. Right. And I'm sending a lot of data directly to China that I don't care about. So all of my, whatever work posts and influencer marketing, I'm delighted to have that on LinkedIn. But when it comes to my clearance level, I'm not going to post that. Now, can you post it? Yes, you can. It's not illegal. You're not going to get in trouble for posting your clearance level. You should list it on your resume. So if you have your resume, posted to LinkedIn or share it somewhere, yes, I think but also too, I'm not going to post my resume on LinkedIn either because it has PII on it that I don't want out there. So there's just the two sides of it. I'm not posting personal information on publicly crawled platforms. That's literally why ClearanceJobs exists, is that so you can post your PII somewhere where we're not sharing our API with third parties. But is it illegal? No. Can you do it? Yes. Am I, Lindy Kyzer, ClearanceJobs, going to tell you to do it? Absolutely not.
Well, if you're say you're in the job market, you have a clearance or particularly high clearance. I mean, we know what your answer is going to be, but does it make sense to list it out there so recruiters can see, initially, okay, he might be worth me DMing about this role?
They can tell by your employment history, which I do list on there. I do think it's a great, they have it on their list, your previous employers. Oh, Bob, who worked at Lockheed Martin, probably has a clearance. It doesn't take a lot of reading between line. And also too, how do you get a job in today's market? Networking. And so I think it's a very passive process just to list your information there. And I think, again, folks are like, oh, well, I'm not going to be able to know if they have a clearance if they don't list it. I'm like, maybe they should just reach out to you and send you a message. And in that message, say that I have a TSSCI and a private message, which has also probably been hacked or whatever. But I feel a little bit more comfortable with that than also, okay, this might be unpopular, but a clearance is a credential, but it's probably not the only thing that's going to get you the job.
Right.
So two, it is one credential that you have, but I get a little if that's all you got, that's your top mark, show me more. Let's try a little harder. Let's bring a little bit more. So I do think the purpose of social media is to like personalize yourself in the job process. I think there's a lot of other elements that can do that beyond your clearance level, which is not a super personal part of who you are.
So how difficult is it these days? Because I feel like maybe 5 years ago, there were a lot more companies that were sponsoring people to get clearances. And I don't know if it's a governmental process or what, but it seems like nowadays, especially if it's for a full scope polygraph, they're not like the companies or whoever can't sponsor them. They need people who already have them. Have you noticed that, or is there a reason for that? Am I making this up?
You're not making it up. I think it's a huge issue within the contracting process and the way contracts are written right now that we see a lot of folks that just have those requirements baked in. It's nothing that the employer or the recruiter can do, but it's just we have these contract requirements and they're being just a lot tighter about who has clearance eligibility. I think, again, because blame Teixeira, blame, the leaks and issues, it's gotten harder for folks to just like, hey, I'm just going to upgrade your clearance, right? Just to have you at the ready if I need it. There have been seasons within cleared employment where employers were better able to do that. I think right now the labor market has been tight enough and the contracts are written tight enough that we don't have a lot of opportunities for clearance upgrades. Now, some employers can, but a heavy preference is based on having those requirements already baked in.
So what I see a lot of particularly is people that are like desperate for full scope polygraph cleared people. And if it's me, I'm thinking, okay, well, if I have somebody who has a TSSCI with a CI poly, bring them in, give them a 4-hour, full scope polygraph examination, and then boom, now they have the FSP. But it's like, well, we can't do that for some reason. You have to come with it. But like, it seems like it would be a pretty low lift just to elevate them in that way. But that doesn't seem to be something that happens.
Well, that's another one. There's a currently not enough polygraph examiners. The same thing we see with like backlogs and clearance processing times are starting to get worse again. They were better for a while, now they're worse. There are a lot of delays in getting a polygraph done. So even if they brought you in, it might take them 6 months to get that polygraph done. So depending on what the contract is, again, if you have a year period of performance on a contract, you need somebody that starts today that has that polygraph. You don't have the ambiguous amount of time that it might take. So that's an area where clearance reform can help with the employment process by saying, hey, let's make the polygraph process more streamlined and move faster so that our contractors can have a better time getting folks cleared.
So at a macro level, what is the cleared space looking like these days, the cleared job market? And then what are you forward looking with the new administration, with Elon and the Doge? How do you see it looking in the next few months and years?
I mean, we still have a tight labor market when it comes to cleared candidates. Now that's all about skill matching, right? Like, I wish I could kind of put a heat map over this and say, because I always get the feedback like, hey, I have a clearance and I'm on ClearanceJobs and I have not found a position. Well, you have to drill in and look at the skill set, see what skills people have. And I always say, like, so look at the job opportunities within your area, within your field, and see what those, especially again for service members transitioning, because the issue is your skills and capabilities are so broad and jobs are just not written, especially contract jobs are not written with that breadth. So you kind of have to drill down to what skill set you're looking for and try to find a match. And it might be one of your third and fourth tier skill sets that you have, but you could upskill it and get into one of those labor categories that is more in demand. But because the cleared talent pool itself is limited, it is like having a clearance is a huge value add. I don't see, unfortunately, our geopolitical climate getting any safer. So we have a lot of threats in the US. I do think that the new administration will kind of look to build up kind of our traditional defense industrial base, build that up, but also be looking to innovate and apply different ideas. So I don't think it's just like defense bloat. I think we'll be looking at building out capabilities that are going to fit the needs of the government and applying new skills. AI, obviously, it makes me like a little sad to say it because I just feel like I'm talking buzzwords, but certain skills are going to be in demand. Again, the cleared talent pool perpetually always in demand.
So we know kind of anything in like cyber, IT, engineering, AI, those tend to be what I'm seeing are jobs that a lot of places are looking to fill with cleared personnel. But are there other areas maybe that people don't think about that still need cleared personnel that we might not think about? Or is that pretty much the hot area for anyone with a clearance who wants to get employed tomorrow.
It's definitely not. I mean, I see positions in healthcare listed and management and finance. And so like there are a lot of different areas. So I would say like it is a very broad career field, like having a clear, and that's what I love clearance jobs, because the common denominator is security clearance and clearance eligibility. But within that, I constantly see different emerging skill sets, jobs come up, employers that are looking to hire, blue collar positions. Again, it's an issue for contracting. We're not necessarily seeing it, but skills-based hiring being big, graphic design. There's just a lot of different areas where there actually is a need for folks with clearances to work and support these government agencies, national security missions, and a whole host of jobs.
I got a couple questions about people that hold a certain clearance level but want to get that clearance, elevated to the next level. If they want to do that, what is the best mechanism to do that? Is there a mechanism?
You have to look for an employer who's willing to upgrade that clearance. And there are some. It's literally like upskilling. It's just upskilling into a different clearance level. Like I said before, it's the issue of the constraint of depending on the contractor and the employer. So a bigger contractor might be more likely to do that. You can search clearance upgrade eligible, reach out to employers and say, hey, I don't have the clearance level for this. Are there any sponsorship opportunities? And you might find some of those, but it's one of those frustrating cart before the horse scenarios, right? I wish I could just tell people like, yeah, you could, like a certification, you could go in and upgrade your clearance, but it's simply not that easy, because the cost difference between a secret and a TS is like 500 versus 5,000. So
I meant to ask that question. I hear all sorts of numbers thrown out about the value of a secret or a top secret. So you said, like at a top secret clearance level, what is the dollar value of that? I've heard 60,000. I've heard 200,000. You just said 5,000. Where are?
Well, that's the cost. That's the cost of the investigation. I think on ClearanceJobs, our compensation report will come out, I think, in February. So we can see then. I think we've typically seen the cost difference between a secret and a TS, all other skills being the same, is like a $20K bonus, right? So if you have a secret versus a TS, you're going to make. Now, and again, you conflate that a lot, because if you add a master's and you're adding more, if you have years of experience, you're different. So again, if all things are equal on the position, having a TS versus a secret is going to add maybe $20,000 onto your salary. And again, the reason why employers might necessarily upgrade you, and again, employers don't pay for the clearance, don't get me wrong, but the government does. And the government issues has fewer positions that require secret clearance that require TS clearance eligibility than secret. And they're not going to go around issuing top secret clearances that they don't need to, because the cost of doing those is $5,000 versus $500 to perform the investigation. Because secret is largely an automated process versus top secret requires a lot more investigative work.
Right. It's a bit more manual in terms of digging into people's background. To your previous point, I'm going to give a plug for any active duty people out there who are transitioning, and maybe they only have a secret, maybe they don't have a clearance at all. If you join the Guard or Reserve, you get into a military intelligence or cyber unit. They'll train you up, give you the MOS, which guess what, comes with a top secret clearance. So you go do that. Now you have your top secret clearance. Now you can go forth and get that job in the civilian sector using clearance jobs and do some cool stuff in the military as well, which is something I think not a lot of transitioning military folks necessarily think about, or even people currently in the Guard or Reserve. Maybe they're just an HR person. Will go out and see what else is out there and see how that can help. The military can help you upskill and help you in your career. So before we go, I do want to jump back to that question of who owns. So I get asked this all the time if I'm applying for a job or whatever. All right, who owns your clearance? Well, I don't really know, and who is like housing it in the secret database where it lives. Is it my company? Is it the Army? Is it not OPM, but the other agency that sort of coordinates it? Who owns it?
I think so. Maybe it's because my son popped in here a billion times, but I'm reminded of like there's this children's book, and then we just got a game for Christmas, like Pickle or something. Does it fit? I'm making this sound.
That one.
Is a house for me or whatever. So it's like a shoe is a house for a foot. But maybe like remind of like what is a house? Like where does your clearance live? What is the house of your clearance?
Right.
Nowhere, because the security clearance doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a security clearance. The policy is actually eligibility to access classified information. Every time we talk about security clearances, we're talking about a nonsense word that we made up to make sense around the term eligibility to access classified information. Eligibility is always tied to a position. So you don't actually, You have nothing, people clearances. No, I don't. Like, you don't actually have. You have eligibility. What you have is eligibility, but the eligibility is around the position designation. You are cleared to have eligibility to access a certain amount of information, but you don't actually hold anything, right? So I think it's I'm making it way more complicated than it should be. I like how I started with a children's book and a game, and now I've gone. But I think people ask, like, well, it's my clearance, right? Well, no, it's your eligibility, which the government has granted to you. Where it sits, again, for you as a reservist, you probably you're in the government system of record, and they should be able to see within that system of record, within the Defense Information System for Security, or NBIS, or whatever we're calling it now, that you have that eligibility through your reserve component and also through your contractor, because your contractor needs to have your eligibility too. So you can have multiple accesses, right?
Okay.
Because that is the access point, and what you have is eligibility. And somewhere in the squishy middle between those two things is the security clearance, but actually, which doesn't actually exist. So you have an eligibility. There is an access that you're granted within the position. The person who has the security clearance is actually the job. So if we're talking about, because position designations are given the secret, the TS, the confidential, which nobody has, that's actually tied to a job. So again, as a reservist, your military intelligence position requires a top secret clearance. That's where that requirement comes from. The minute you separate from that job, you have eligibility to jump into another job that requires it, but you don't actually have that clearance, because that clearance was actually within the house. A house is a house for me, Eric, is within the house of that job.
Right.
And you're actually transitioning into that based on the eligibility that you carry. Security clearances don't exist. I feel like we've finally gone deep state existential thoughts right as we close out, Eric.
Be able to
security clearances don't even exist.
I want to be able
that might not be true.
A PDF document that says security clearance granted to Eric Evans that I can carry around with me and show people if need be.
We should have VIP clearance cards made. Secret Squirrel Society cards.
Now we're thinking outside the box.
If you are in the Secret Squirrel Society, you get a special card.
I love it.
I think I made that way too complicated at the end. I feel now deeply sorry for all of people who have to listen to that. No, but it is just super wonky, a wonky process. There is eligibility, there is access. The clearances are tied to the positions, not the people at all.
And then you have those other kind of crazy Yankee White and, Q clearance, which I think is Department of Energy. And I don't even.
That's Department of Energy. We have SCI, we have SAP. Now we're going down the rabbit
hole. Well, thank you so much, Lindy, for joining us. We're going to have you back on in the future. So many questions, such a ripe topic area. To the audience, hit up ClearanceJobs. They publish a lot of great content. A lot of the stuff we've talked about today. They have awesome cleared jobs, awesome cleared companies. Lindy, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. And we will talk to you soon for sure. And to the audience,
thank you, Eric.
stay part-timing.